Previously on SpongeMikey.
There was a mouse in my home. Yeah, we were able to get rid of it, but the smell is still here. Those were also my only shoes.
3 months later.
Hey, what's up guys? Mikey here. After I got rid of what I thought was my only pair of shoes a few months ago, I actually found another old pair of shoes in the attic recently. But they were in there for years and they smell toxic now because a f***ing mouse clearly had issues with them for some reason. And I got new shoes anyway, so I don't even need these. But I don't want this pair of shoes making the garbage can smell as bad as the last pair did, because I got a warning from the garbage man about throwing away bad smelling shoes. But luckily, there's a simple solution to that. Something we all use every day. We have technology. Well, that didn't work. Technology is shit.
Wet Painters is the episode where SpongeBob and Patrick paint the inside of Mr. Krabs' house with paint that's permanent and try their hardest not to make a mess. This episode aired on May 10, 2002 and is the episode that coined the terms time card and title card by fans to refer to the art with text that pops up to show a passage of time in the episodes and that showed the episodes' names at the start, all taken off by this line right here.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
One of everybody's favorite SpongeBob meta jokes. Same with me. This is an episode that comes to everybody's mind when thinking about SpongeBob, whether it's the whole series, seasons 1, 2, and 3, or the series as a whole. This is one of my most memorable episodes of all time, so let's watch the episode and go in depth on why that's the case. So the episode starts up and it's a slow day at the Krusty Krab. SpongeBob and Patrick are causing chaos, which of course gets Mr. Krabs' attention. He's not happy to see SpongeBob and Patrick's antics, and SpongeBob explains the chaos was a ritual to attract customers, which can only work by getting hurt, which Squidward told them. Mr. Krabs had a more important job for them to do. He took them to the outside of his house and hyped up their assignment, which was to paint the inside of his house.
What does that have to do with the Krusty Krab?
Mr. Krabs gives them an extremely strict warning about the paint being permanent and threatens to cut off their asses and mount them over his fireplace if they get paint on anything other than the wall. SpongeBob and Patrick saw all the decorations on the walls and shelves, but instead of making sense, they decided to just paint around all the knickknacks. After they set up tarp that still doesn't cover the whole floor, SpongeBob opens the cans of paint with a screwdriver. The first can was fine, but the second was a ripoff. SpongeBob and Patrick take out some small brushes, and SpongeBob prepares to paint the wall, but keeps stalling. 1 hour later. He continues to sweat before he starts painting. 2 hours later. And even again for 3 hours later. And Patrick ran out of time cards.
I didn't.
4 hours later. SpongeBob finally starts painting, but it starts running down the wall, and SpongeBob blows it to avoid touching the knickknacks, and it continues until he uses a hairdryer and creates a paint bubble. SpongeBob sees a giant paint bubble and becomes terrified. Patrick creates a second, and they can join together. And then Patrick inflates the bubble till it pops. But it luckily paints all the walls perfectly fine without touching anything else.
So that's why they didn't remove anything from the walls.
But then SpongeBob spots a microscopic drop of paint on Mr. Krabs' first dollar and starts to stress out. He tries wiping the paint off, but accidentally covers the whole dollar with it. SpongeBob and Patrick start to fear for their asses being gone, but Patrick decides to try and get the paint off anyway, despite Mr. Krabs' claim that the paint was permanent. But after many attempts with various objects, nothing worked.
We have technology.
It didn't work.
You can say that again.
Patrick starts going on a rant of Mr. Krabs hanging the dollar on the wall in the first place and states that you could hang up any dollar bill on the wall in its place and it wouldn't make a difference. SpongeBob tells Patrick to do exactly that, but when Patrick takes out a dollar, he just spends it on a vending machine that Mr. Krabs just so happens to have in his house. And very shortly after, Mr. Krabs arrives home, so SpongeBob has one last idea. When Mr. Krabs comes inside, the lights were off, so he turns them on to see how the walls look. He was impressed, but started to panic, and SpongeBob and Patrick begged for forgiveness. But he only panicked over his knickknacks being dusted, the floor molding, and his Dollarama having one misaligned doll. But nothing was really bad. He then finds a stack of paintings jutting from the wall where his first dollar used to be.
Used to be? You never took it off the wall.
He took the paintings off the wall, and SpongeBob tried to hide the first dollar, but to no avail. Mr. Krabs was not happy to see paint on the dollar, but luckily he licked the dollar clean and said that the paint actually comes off with saliva. SpongeBob thought the threat was to make sure he and Patrick would be more careful with the job, but Mr. Krabs said it was just to mess with them. SpongeBob and Patrick walked away in anger while Mr. Krabs just laughed hysterically. He started to spit while laughing, causing all the paint to come off the walls, much to his disappointment, and the episode ends.
I'll say, that joke wasn't even a joke with a zinger.
So that was Wet Painters, and that is such a great episode. There are so many amazing things to praise in this one. Starting off with the funny parts, I've laughed at so many lines and sequences from this episode throughout my life. I love the sequences of SpongeBob and Patrick getting hurt at the beginning, and Mr. Krabs' window falling off the wall. SpongeBob and Patrick trying various means to wash the paint off the dollar, the paint drop bouncing off all the tarps, SpongeBob's constant yelling at Patrick to get the dollar out of the vending machine, and the two of them trying to hide their mistake from Mr. Krabs. The list goes on with things like Patrick telling SpongeBob to be careful when opening the first paint can, and the build up to learning what the assignment is going to be. But my favorite sequence throughout was always the part with the two giant paint bubbles. It's so humorous to see how SpongeBob's small paint drip kept running down the wall and become a giant bubble after SpongeBob used the hairdryer, and how Patrick blew another bubble, and then when the huge paint bubble just inflated until it exploded. Which also means that there were only 2 drops of paint that were used in the whole room. That's just mind-boggling. I wish that worked when my room was being repainted. Patrick's line right here is also hysterical to me, and I can't really explain why.
Nonsense!
Even though this scene is supposed to be suspenseful because the paint isn't supposed to touch anything else, complete with one of the scariest SpongeBob music tracks from the whole series, I still can't help but think it's really hilarious, and the way the walls are covered in paint ends the scene perfectly. I will say, the first time I watched it, when SpongeBob took the dollar off the wall, I was kind of expecting another paint splash to cover this part, similar to this shot with SpongeBob, but it never happened. That's not a complaint, I just felt like sharing. There's a lot of funny gags here too. I like when Patrick pulls a shrub out of the hole from under his eyes, this visual of SpongeBob and Patrick in a mess at the Krusty Krab, the paint drip bouncing off all the tarps, SpongeBob's reflection leaving him behind, the time card meta humor, Patrick with a menacing axe, and just purely seeing SpongeBob hanging around.
Boo!
I also remember a time when a friend of mine and I were goofing around in science class in high school and yelling the "Careful, SpongeBob!" when working with some materials in that class. Nothing got broken, but we did get a noise complaint at one point. There's also some funny faces throughout, like this one, or this one, or this one, or this one, and this one where SpongeBob and Patrick freak out. I feel like this is how the wacky faces are done right. We do get some, but they don't overtake the whole scene or the whole episode, and there's more to the scenes in which these faces appear in, like the music, and there's more jokes to the scenes, like the dialogue actually being well written. Unlike the later seasons where they seem to rely on the exaggerated facial expressions more than anything, and there's a much better mix of the funny faces and actual funny jokes and sequences in this episode than something like episode 464, The Nitwitting from season 12, where there's too many wacky expressions and characters being too stupid for it to feel well written or actually funny compared to this one. This episode also has some fun details sprinkled throughout, such as this blinking you'll miss it shot of Penny the Pirate appearing as a painting from the stack, the details in the close-up of the tiny paint drip on the dollar, and all the various treasures and knickknacks throughout Mr. Krabs' house. Something else that's interesting is that, in this episode, SpongeBob walks angrily away while Mr. Krabs is laughing at his expense. This is very different from most episodes of the show where they end with SpongeBob laughing at somebody else's expenses, or when he laughs along with them. So that's something else that makes this episode unique. I like that this episode introduces Mr. Krabs' first dollar ever made. Obviously, knowing Mr. Krabs' character, he would keep his first dollar he ever earned. But I like how it comes back in future episodes. The story of how he made his first dollar is revealed later in episode 156, Friend or Foe from season 5, and it appears in Mr. Krabs' office in episode 440, Bottle Burglars from season 11. It may not have anything to do with this episode in particular, but it's nice that it was never forgotten over the years of the show, when a lot else was. And speaking of the dollar, there are some people who wonder why SpongeBob and Patrick didn't think of flipping the bill over, and I'll explain that away by saying that the front and back sides of a dollar are both different, so Mr. Krabs would notice that it was flipped over since his first dollar is his most prized possession after all. And of course, you got the stuff everybody else talks about, like Patrick using the computer, his booing SpongeBob, and the crayon drawing. I can't add anything new to that conversation, I just mentioned them because I'm obligated to. I will say, when I rewatched this as a teenager, I did kinda wonder why Pearl didn't show up at all, since this episode takes place almost entirely in Mr. Krabs' house. I think it would have been neat to see her in this episode somehow, like maybe a gag where she gets blasted out of the house by the paint explosion or something. But that's hardly a complaint because this episode still works perfectly the way it is. I've been singing my praises for this one so much, I don't really have much more to say, so I'll just share this one final thought. Why do we never see the Dollarama again in the future? They brought back the first dollar later in the series, so why not the Dollarama?
Wet Painters is an amazing episode. It's a classic and it's never lost its magic even after all these years. Not a single nitpick can change how funny this one is. Not even the ones I just did. This is an episode that I can always go back and have a good laugh at, no matter how old I get, and that's just great. But you know what I just realized? Technology doesn't work, so I'm going to use air freshener on the smelly old shoes. Ah, that does smell better.